your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and we got a special video just dropped this morning. The video we all been waiting for, n.SSign Funk Jam official music video. I've been waiting for this video a long time, and it finally released this morning. I seen it before I went to sleep, and I had told myself when I woke up I had to react to this. So if you see my previous video, I recently did n.SSign Memories of Us. Make sure you go check that out, and also did the Performance 37 of Funk Jam, and also check out Wormhole video. I got a bunch of n.SSign videos. Make sure you go check those out. But first, let's jump into this music video. I'm excited. I know you are excited. I know everybody loves n.SSign, and let's jump to it. Make sure you like, comment below any video suggestions, and if you're new, subscribe, and let's hit that like button. All right, let's jump into the news video.
You hear that? That's the sound of a special one. Yo.
I need a breakfast full of break beats, seamless. Also barely make it complete. A couple bars talking secret so much you give me. So give it away, give the drama some. 네 심장을 움직이는 쿵소리 맞춰 feel me.
Let's get together 너와 만들어낸 symphony. 가벼운 허밍마저 완벽한 이 멜로디. Do you want some? Well I got some. 그대로 나 따라오는 널 말려. 깊어지는 떨림 속 퍼져가는 saxophone. Join but we're not too troubled. 아직은 이
Yeah, the way he hit the vocals, when he hit the trombone line, this sounds so good, but like this, I really like this video. Like it's so like I'm sort of saying I can't talk. It's like really it's really like kind of like artsy or whatever, if that makes sense. I don't know. I'm excited for the video. I can't talk.
You hear that?
But I wasn't expecting it to be like this.
Yo.
I need a breakfast full of break beats, seamless. Also barely make it complete. A couple bars talking secret so much you give me. So give it away, give the drama some. 네 심장을 움직이는 쿵소리 맞춰 feel me.
Let's get together 너와 만들어낸 symphony. 가벼운 허밍마저 완벽한 이 멜로디. Do you want some? Well I got some. 그대로 나 따라오는 널 말려. 깊어지는 떨림 속 퍼져가는 saxophone. Join but we're not too troubled. 아득한 이 불빛 아래 넘칠 듯한 심장 소리만. It's what's going down. 시작해 bass drum, boom boom. 이 리듬 속에 funk jam. 그 소리에 눈빛에 취해. You're listening to a funk jam. Hot damn. 밤새도록 dance. Playing the guitar. The boom bam. 우리들만의 funk jam.
Hey yo, check me out. I'm going in
Like boom, pow.
Got everybody in here watching, going wild. It ain't nothing. I get it on, ba-da-ba-bum. Give me the drums. I'm about to hit 'em like I'm young and this impact. 내가 honey. 당연한 것처럼 너는 하지. We can play some music, maybe two. Shawty, you want that? 나만의 그 빛에 내 답해. That's eye contact.
깊어지는 떨림 속 퍼져가는 saxophone. Join but we're not too troubled. 아득한 이 불빛 아래 넘칠 듯한 심장 소리만. It's what's going down. 시작해 bass drum, boom bam. 이 리듬 속에 funk jam. 서로의 눈빛에 취해. You're listening to a funk jam. Hot damn. 밤새도록 dance. Play the guitar like boom bam. 우리들만의 funk jam. 귀 기울여가 나니 우리 아는 목소리.
Bro, this video and like this song is this. I remember hearing this song for the first time on Performance 32. It was just so good. Like this group, every video that I got on my channel, you can tell my watching reaction. Like this group is so talented. Like I get happy every time I react to the video, whether or not it's like a slow like R&B song or it's like a song like this. It's just really good. Like it just does not. I can like keep going on and on about how good this group this group is.
Do
Ooh, I like the transitions.
마치 내일이 없는 듯이 너와 나
Such a getting the video sucker. Let's go back. We're gonna go back. We're gonna do a little bit pause and just go around though. Oh, I didn't know that was a
You hear
picture.
that? That's the sound of a special one. Yo.
I need a breakfast full of breakbeats, please. Also barely make it complete. A couple bars.
Oh, I didn't know
think
this.
So much you give me, so give it away. Give the drama some 네 심장.
I didn't know you could see his shadow right now. I didn't notice that the first time. Like you see his shadow on the wall right now.
drama some 네 심장을 움직이는 쿵소리 맞춰 feel me.
Let's get together 너와 만들어낸 심포니 가벼운 허밍마저 완벽한 이 멜로디 Do you want some? Well I got some 그대로 나 따라오는 널 맡겨 깊어지는 떨림 속 퍼져가는 saxophone Join but we're not too troubled 아득한 이 불빛 아래 넘칠 듯한 심장 소리만
I like the whole rides, motor garage scene. I like that right there. That's a pretty cool setting. I really like that.
It's what's going down. 시작해 bass drum, boom bam. 이 rhythm 속에 funk jam. The circle with the 빛의 취해. You're listening to a funk jam. 밤새도록 dance. Play the guitar, boom bam. 우리들만의 funk jam.
Hey yo, check me out. I'm going in
Like,
like boom.
wow.
Got everybody in here watching, going wild. It ain't nothing. I get it on. Ba-da-ba-bum. Give me the drums. I'm about to hit 'em like I'm young and this impact. 내가 하니 당연한 것처럼 너는 하지. We can play some music, maybe two. Shorty, you want that? 나만의 그 빛에 내 답해. Let's eye contact.
깊어지는 떨림 속 퍼져가는 saxophone Join but we're not too troubled 아득한 이 불빛 아래 넘칠 듯한 심장 소리만 It's what's going down 시작해 bass drum
Where did airplane come from?
시작해
Like the airplane just came out of nowhere and landed on top of the building.
bass drum boom bam 이 리듬 속에 번져 서로의 눈빛에 취해 You're listening to our vibe Bass jam 밤새도록 dance baby guitar like boom bam 우리들만의 funk jam 귀 기울여가 많이 우리 아는 목소리 음표처럼 이어지는 말 계속되는 moving 멈출 수 없는 grooving 마치 내일이 없는 듯이 너와 나
Hey, that boy been singing this now. That boy been singing. You can feel it. He was in it. Hey, he was in it. All right, that was n.SSign Funk Jam official music video, what we all been waiting for since the performance video and everything. And make sure if you love this group and this song just as much as I do, make sure you just smash that like button, man. Let's try to get to like 1 million likes, man. Let's get this video to 1 million views. Make sure you share, tell everybody who's a fan of this group, and make sure they see this video. Video dope. I give it 3,000 out of 10. Relate group. Make sure you check out my other n.SSign videos. Those are pretty dope too. If you're new, make sure you subscribe and comment below any video suggestions you have. And I will see you guys in the next n.SSign video. I'm so happy this video came out today. It's amazing. It's amazing.